The oscillation was subsonic at first. It wasn't a sound you could hear. It was a ghost in the floorboards, a nervous tick shivering through the concrete foundation of the applied aerodynamics building. To the 25 doctoral candidates standing on the observation deck, the vibration was invisible. They were looking at the monitors, mesmerized by the stream of green data cascading down the screens. To Professor Alden Silas, the vibration was irrelevant, a minor artifact of the building's settling, nothing compared to the brilliance of the turbine prototype spinning in the test chamber. But to David, the vibration was a warning. He was 3 floors down, standing on a metal grate in the utility chase, his hands wrapped around a wrench that was as long as his forearm. He felt the tremor travel up through the soles of his work boots, bypassing his ears and settling directly into the base of his spine. It was the specific, nauseating frequency of a bolt about to shear. David paused. He wiped a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He wasn't looking at a computer screen. He was looking at a pressure gauge on the main HVAC intake, a brass dial clouded with condensation. The needle was twitching, not moving, just shivering, trapped between 45 and 46 psi. He checked his watch. 10:45 p.m. "Don't wake up, baby," he whispered, his voice lost in the roar of the air handlers. Just outside the heavy steel door of the utility chase, in the cramped break room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, his daughter, Kiana, was asleep on the vinyl sofa. She was 7 years old, and she was wrapped in his heavy canvas coat, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm he had memorized. She had been sent home from school with a fever 2 days ago. He couldn't afford a sitter. He couldn't afford to miss the shift. So she was here, hidden in the blind spot of the university's prestige, breathing the recycled air of a building designed to test wind, not sustain life. The vibration in the floor spiked. The needle on the gauge jumped to 48. David frowned. He knew the system. He knew that when the wind tunnel upstairs ramped past 80% capacity, it created a vacuum effect that pulled hard on the building's passive intake. Usually, the dampers adjusted. Tonight, they were fighting. He needed to finish the compressor repair and get Kiana home before the night bus stopped running at midnight. But the building was groaning. It was a low, metallic complaint, the sound of a ship straining against an anchor. He put the wrench down. He couldn't ignore it. If the intake manifold cracked, it wouldn't just ruin the professor's experiment. It would dump halon gas and dust into the ventilation system. Into the break room. David stepped out of the chase, locking the grate behind him. He walked down the corridor, his boots heavy, his eyes scanning the ceiling tiles for stress fractures. He wasn't a physicist. He was the guy they called when the toilets backed up or the air conditioning rattled. He was invisible by trade. He took the service elevator up to the 4th floor, the observation deck. The doors opened, and the air hit him, cold, sterile, and buzzing with tension. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the massive reinforced glass window looking into the test chamber and the banks of monitors surrounding it. Professor Silas was standing at the console, his back rigid. He was a man who cultivated an image of effortless intellect, but tonight, the sweat glistening on his neck betrayed him. He was shouting at a graduate student who was frantically typing on a keyboard. "It is not a sensor error," Silas barked. "The drag coefficient is drifting. We are losing efficiency in the boundary layer. Tighten the simulation." "I can't, Professor," the student stammered. "The math is perfect. The equation predicts a smooth flow. But the physical model it's stuttering." David stood by the elevator, holding his toolbox. He shouldn't be here. This was the clean zone. But the floor was shaking harder now. The vibration was rattling the coffee mugs on the side tables. "Excuse me," David said. His voice was a deep baritone, soft but resonant. It didn't cut through the room, it occupied it. No one turned. They were too focused on the failure unfolding on the screens. "Excuse me," David said again, slightly louder. Professor Silas spun around. When he saw the gray uniform, the name patch that just said maintenance, and the scuffed boots, his face twisted into a mask of incredulity. "We are in the middle of a live test," Silas snapped. "The trash cans are emptied on Tuesdays." David didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He held the toolbox against his leg, his posture relaxed but grounded. "I'm not here for the trash, sir," David said. "I'm here about the vibration. You're shaking the HVAC intake on the lower level." The pressure is spiking. Silas stared at him for a second, then let out a short, harsh laugh. He turned to the room of students. You hear that? We are trying to revolutionize laminar flow dynamics, and the janitor is worried about the air conditioning. A few students chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between the angry professor and the large man by the elevator. Silas turned back to David, his finger pointing at the door. This is a $10 million prototype, not a ceiling fan. The vibration is expected. It's high-velocity torque. Now leave. If you disrupt the airflow in the hallway by opening that door again, I will have your supervisor terminate your contract. David looked at the professor. He looked at the frantic students. Then he looked through the glass into the test chamber. The prototype was a sleek, silver airfoil suspended in the center of the tunnel. The air was rushing over it at 400 miles per hour, visible as streaks of white smoke. But David didn't look at the foil. He looked at the room itself. He saw the way the smoke was curling near the floor of the chamber. He saw the slight shimmer in the air near the rear exhaust vents. He knew airflow. He didn't know it from a textbook. He knew it from 20 years of crawling through ductwork, from balancing pressure gradients in hospitals, from feeling the way air moved when it was trapped, squeezed, and forced to turn corners. It's choking, David said quietly. Silas froze. What? The room, David said, gesturing with his free hand. It's not the prototype. The prototype is fine. The room is choking. You're pushing too much air into a space that can't exhale fast enough. That vibration isn't torque. It's back pressure. It's a harmonic loop. Silas stepped away from the console, walking toward David until he was uncomfortably close. I have calculated the volumetric displacement of this chamber down to the cubic millimeter. My equation accounts for every variable of intake and exhaust. Are you telling me that you, a man who fixes leaky faucets, have found a flaw in the Navier-Stokes application that 20 PhDs missed? David looked down at Silas. He thought of Kiana. He thought of the way her chest rattled when she had an asthma attack, the way she panicked when she couldn't get the air out. It was the same mechanism. The room was having an asthma attack. I'm saying the air doesn't care about your math if the vent is stuck, David said calmly. The rear baffles. They're auto-adjusting based on a linear curve, but air compresses exponentially when it hits a wall. You need to open the bypass. Get out, Silas whispered. The venom in his voice was cold. Get out. David held the professor's gaze for a long moment. He saw the fear behind the arrogance. Silas was losing control of the experiment, and he needed someone to blame. David was the convenient target. Yes, sir, David said. Just trying to help. He turned and pressed the button for the elevator. As the doors closed, he saw Silas turn back to the monitors, screaming for them to increase the power, to force the air through the resistance. The elevator descended. The vibration in the shaft was violent now. The lights flickered. David didn't go back to the break room. He went to the basement. He walked fast, his boots echoing on the concrete. The sound of the building's distress was deafening down here. The pipes were singing. If Silas pushed the turbine to 100%, the back pressure wouldn't just ruin the data. It would blow the seals on the main exhaust. The explosion would be contained, but the shock wave would shatter the glass in the lobby, and it would flood the HVAC system with smoke. David reached the main mechanical room. It was a cathedral of machinery, massive boilers, chillers, and the giant plenum of the wind tunnel's exhaust system. He dropped his toolbox. He ran to the control panel for the rear baffles. It was locked out. A red light glowed next to the digital interface. Remote control only, lab override active. He couldn't change it from the panel. Silas had the controls locked upstairs. David looked at the massive pneumatic actuators that controlled the flaps. They were hydraulic. They were controlled by a localized computer loop that took instructions from the lab upstairs. He grabbed a ladder and leaned it against the ductwork. He climbed up to the sensor array. A small black box bolted to the side of the duct that read the air pressure and told the computer how much to open the flaps. David pulled a multimeter from his belt. He popped the cover off the sensor box. He looked at the wiring. It was a simple 4 to 20 milliamperes loop. The sensor sent a signal. 4 milliamperes was zero pressure. 20 milliamperes was maximum dangerous pressure. Silas's equation was telling the computer to expect a linear increase. But the room was reacting exponentially. The sensor was sending a safe signal because it was calibrated for a different kind of turbulence. The computer thought the room was fine. so it kept the flaps half closed to maintain optimal pressure. The room was screaming, but the computer was deaf. David needed to change the signal. He needed to tell the computer the truth. He didn't have a keyboard. He didn't have code. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled notebook he used to track his hours. He ripped out a page. He pulled a pencil from behind his ear. He quickly scribbled a calculation. It wasn't abstract algebra. It was Ohm's law. Target pressure equals P_actual plus V squared slash 2G. Resistance required equals 220 ohms parallel. He needed to trick the sensor into reporting the future pressure, not the current one. He needed to amplify the signal so the computer would panic and open the vents before the critical threshold was reached. He calculated the resistance needed to offset the signal voltage. 220 ohms. He climbed down. He dug through his toolbox. He found a small resistor, a spare from a thermostat repair. He climbed back up. His hands were steady, despite the pipe next to his head shaking so hard it blurred. He stripped the wire on the signal loop. He twisted the resistor into the circuit, creating a bridge. He wasn't hacking the code. He was changing the reality the code was seeing. He was adding a variable to the physical world. He taped the connection with electrical tape. Then, he took the scrap of paper with his calculation, a messy scrawl of voltage drops and pressure coefficients, and jammed it under the wire clamp, securing it so the next tech would know what happened. He closed the box. The effect was instantaneous. The hydraulic actuators hissed, a loud, aggressive release of pressure. The massive steel flaps of the exhaust vents groaned and then swung wide open. Whoosh! The sound was like a jet engine taking off, but in reverse. The pent-up air rushed out of the tunnel, expelling the choke point. The pressure in the mechanical room dropped so fast David's ears popped. The vibration stopped. Dead. The pipes went silent. The floor stopped shivering. The building settled back into its foundation with a heavy sigh. David climbed down the ladder. He wiped the dust from his hands. He picked up his toolbox. He checked his watch. 11:15 p.m. He walked back to the break room. Kiana was sitting up, rubbing her eyes, the coat slipping off her shoulders. "Daddy," she rasped, her voice thick with sleep. "Did you fix the noise?" David knelt in front of her. He put his hand on her forehead. She was cool. The air in the room was still, the vent overhead humming a soft, steady, safe rhythm. "Yeah, baby," David said, smiling. "I opened a window. That's all. Can we go home now?" "Yeah, we can go home." Upstairs, the silence was deafening in a different way. Professor Silas stared at the monitors. The red warning lines had vanished. The green data stream had stabilized into a perfect, smooth curve. The drag coefficient had dropped to near zero. The efficiency was higher than the theoretical maximum. "What happened?" Silas whispered. "Who stabilized the flow?" The graduate students were checking their terminals. "Sir, the rear exhaust dampers just went to 100% open. The system auto-corrected." "It couldn't have," Silas said. "The algorithm limits them to 60% to maintain back pressure." "Well, they're open," the student said. "And look at the numbers. The turbulence is gone. The boundary layer is perfect." Silas didn't celebrate. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. He turned and ran for the elevator. He went down to the basement. He ran past the boilers to the rear exhaust assembly. He saw the ladder leaning against the duct. He saw the cover of the sensor box slightly askew. Silas climbed the ladder. He popped the cover. He saw the splice. The cheap, blue electrical tape wrapped around a 20-cent resistor. A crude, physical hack that had bridged the gap between his perfect theory and the messy reality of air. And then he saw the paper. He pulled it out. It was a wrinkled page from a pocket notebook, stained with grease. On it, written in heavy pencil, was the equation. It wasn't a derivation of Navier-Stokes. It was a fluid resistance calculation, solved for voltage. It was a translation. Someone had translated the language of the wind into the language of the circuit. At the bottom of the note, there was a simple message scrawled in the margin. "Air needs room to leave before it can enter." Maintenance Silas stood on the ladder, holding the paper. He looked at the resistor. He looked at the massive vents that were now breathing freely. He realized the janitor hadn't just fixed the machine. He had saved it. The vibration Silas had ignored was the machine choking to death, and his own arrogance had been the gag. Silas climbed down slowly. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket, next to his expensive fountain pen. He walked out of the mechanical room and into the hallway. He saw the door to the maintenance break room open. He approached it quietly. The room was empty. The lights were off. Silas walked in. He smelled the faint scent of coffee and the lingering warmth of occupancy. On the vinyl table, there was a time card, stamped out at 11:20 p.m. Name, David E. Silas picked up the card. He stood in the dark, quiet room. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the building. He felt like a tenant in a house he didn't understand. He walked back to the elevator, holding the time card like a piece of evidence. The next night, David swiped his badge at the service entrance. The red light blinked. Access denied. His stomach dropped. He thought of the rent. He thought of Kiana's inhaler prescription. He had touched the equipment. He had violated the clean zone. Silas had fired him. He took a breath, steeling himself. He buzzed the intercom. "Security, this is David. My badge isn't working." "Hold on, David," the guard's voice crackled. "Professor Silas left a new badge for you at the front desk. Said you need level 5 clearance for the mechanical rooms." David paused. "Level 5? That's engineering staff." "I don't know, man," the guard said. He left a note, too. David walked to the front desk. The guard handed him a new badge. It didn't say maintenance. It said facilities engineer. And underneath the badge was a folded piece of paper, the grease-stained page from David's notebook. David unfolded it. Beneath his own pencil scratches, there was a note written in crisp, black ink. "You were right. The equation was incomplete without the exit variable. Please see me about the airflow design for the new intake." Silas David stared at the note. He didn't smile. He didn't pump his fist. He felt the weight of the new badge in his hand. It was heavier than the old one. It meant better hours. It meant he could afford a sitter. It meant Kiana wouldn't have to sleep in a break room full of dust. He put the note in his pocket. He clipped the badge to his chest. He walked toward the elevators, not with a swagger, but with the same steady, measured pace he always used. He had a job to do. The building was breathing, but there was a rattle in the heating unit on the 3rd floor, and he was the only one who knew how to listen to it.